There's a bit of a trigger warning here, as there are mentions of abuse. Growing up, I lived with my emotionally and mentally abusive helicopter mom, misogynistic stepdad, and my brother. When I turned 18, my grandparents were kind enough to let me move in with them since they lived so close to my college. This was my out, my way away from that clown show at home, and I was incredibly grateful. I sometimes wonder if my parents hadn't been so hard on me, if this even would have happened at all. But I was an adult, and I made my own decisions. Luckily, though, I managed to learn from them. Once I was free and had much more freedom, I naturally started to rebel a bit more while I was trying to find my own way. I rebelled in everything, from clothing, music, tattoos, and dating. Specifically, I wanted to date the most out-there person just to prove a point, I guess. If I could go back to my 18-year-old self, I would punch myself in the face for these dumbass decisions. I was on a local MySpace forum when I met James. I went to high school with James, and we got along fine, but I hadn't seen him in a couple of years. It turns out that James had suffered some childhood trauma and went to go live with a relative about 8 hours away in another state. He was seemingly living a much more stable life. We started to message each other back and forth, and I liked James a lot. He was different, quirky, and I guess a bit edgy. I started to speak with James more and more frequently, and messages became texts. Somehow in the mix, it became a relationship that I regret to this day. Every day, non-stop texting, and sometimes it would turn dark. James would say things to me that are forever ingrained into my head. He would often tell me about his childhood trauma. He would discuss self-harm and how he enjoyed watching videos of people hurting themselves. Of course, this is a red flag to me now. I'm unsure why I decided to stick around. After a couple of months, James came to visit me. We stayed a few days in a hotel, and it all seemed like a whirlwind. I truly cared about him, but looking back, I don't know if I would necessarily call it love, or simply having a good time. At the time, though, I was convinced this feeling was love, and that it felt like he was the one for me. There was an instance where I had come out of the bathroom at the hotel, and I remember the room being in disarray, clothes strewn everywhere. It was just a giant mess, but James stood there smiling. He got down on one knee and proposed with a small sapphire and diamond ring. I ended up saying yes, but it just didn't feel real. Something about it felt unsettling. When I think about it, I feel a bit nauseous. I guess it's a bit of embarrassment that still lingers or something. And towards the end of his visit, we sobbed together, unsure how we were going to make this work. What options did I have other than to move? I withdrew from all my classes and moved to his area. I remember when I told my parents, my mom was extremely upset that I never discussed this with her, or my stepdad, and I think that conversation fueled me to really stick it out and make it work. In my mind, I was an adult, and this was a huge adult decision. I didn't need to discuss anything with anyone, and no one would ever tell me anything different. We lived in a small room at James's grandmother's house, and we never really left during our whole relationship. He started to act very strange when I mentioned wanting friends, or wanting to go get a job so I could leave the house, even wanting to leave the house in general. I mentioned earlier that James had his quirks and would sometimes do odd things. For example, he had become a huge Insane Clown Posse fan during our relationship. I knew he liked them, but not to the extent of a borderline obsession. They were my cup of tea, but I'm not going to tell someone what they can and can't listen to. But things just got too weird. He had become such a fan that he got a giant tattoo that represented his love for the ICP. He started to only listen to their music, and started to paint his face often in clown makeup. It became such of an obsession that he would try to force me to paint my face, and would get irrationally upset and scream at me. He'd shove me, and even tried to trap me in a closet when I told him I just didn't want to. It was just something that set him off, and I'm unsure as to why. As the days went by, I started to feel more and more isolated, just staying in our room in this house. I was really only ever allowed to leave the bedroom to eat or to use the bathroom. Otherwise, we just stayed in that room. When I did get to leave the house, James had to always be with me, and we would only go to his other relatives' houses or to dinner. I had no friends, I wasn't allowed to get a job, I had no support system. James kept this notebook that he would journal in, and would openly read some of his entries that seemed more mild. I shouldn't have invaded his privacy on this particular day, but honestly, I think it saved my life. James was getting ready for work, and had his notebook laying on the bed. He had been acting quite strange and cold towards me, so I decided to take a peek in the journal. As I read through, I saw his entries mentioning how he wanted to cut me on my privates with a box cutter. He tiptoed around the idea of me not being alive, and this was my way out. My parents and I were somewhat speaking at this time, and my aunt lived a couple of hours from me. I had told everyone that I was coming home, and what I had just read. My aunt packed up and started heading my way immediately, just in case, and to make sure I would be able to safely leave. I told James what I had read, and that I was going to go back home and that this relationship just wasn't going to work. James fell to his knees in tears, begging me not to leave, saying that he loved me, but that quickly changed into anger, with him yelling that he wanted to lock me in his closet so I could never leave. Luckily for me, though, he had to go to work before he could really do anything. While he was out, I packed up my things while listening to his grandma scream at me, and finally, I left. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A few months had gone by, and James and I became just friends. I had come to visit him, which was the last visit I was ever going to make. Nothing bad happened. It wasn't a terrible time or anything, but at that point with his strangeness, I just knew I had to cut him out. The years had gone by quickly after that visit. I would say maybe 3 or 4, and I had heard enough through mutual friends that James had gotten married. I had moved across the country for school, and just to explore a new area and have freedom, which I should have gotten on the first go. James would occasionally try to speak with me on social media. I would just not reply, or the replies would be few and far between. I'm 32 now, and recently got married. I've started to settle down, and my husband and I are trying for our first baby, which is very exciting. James hasn't been a thought in my mind for the past several years at this point, until very recently. James found me on Facebook, and to be honest, I thought he had just disappeared off of social media altogether. At this point, I expressed to him that after so long, we weren't really friends anymore, and it was really inappropriate to just keep messaging me. I asked him, "Can you please stop?" He just replied, "Nah." Fair enough, so I blocked him. Another few months go by. I get a Snapchat request from him. Blocked. Another few months go by. Suddenly a follow on Instagram. I kept my Instagram open because I like to post about my travels and fitness, and I have nothing to hide or anything really to be private about. That is, until he started following me. I went to block his account, and I noticed that it was brand new. No followers, and the only person he followed was me. Since then, I've made everything private, blocked all accounts, went to those sites like Been Verified, and had all my information removed from those databases. I feel like I made a grave mistake as a teenager, and I was able to move on from that and want to live a normal life. I'm unsure why he still lurks around trying to antagonize me and be involved with my life these days. So James, I blocked you on everything. I hope that's a clear message that we never meet again. I'll give a little background about myself for my story. I'm a young gay male living in a medium-sized city. The dating scene is rather limited, as you might guess, and most gay people use apps or websites for meeting others, for encounters or dates. I frequent websites and apps daily, just to see if there's anyone new out there that I haven't already spoken to, yet I rarely actually meet anyone from online. The fear of STIs or being robbed has always been at the back of my mind, so I just generally browse without ever actually meeting anyone. About 6 months ago, while browsing through Craigslist, I found an ad that seemed somewhat to be what I was looking for. The ad was by a man a little older than myself, who seemed to want the exact same things I wanted. He wanted to meet up with a guy my age, get to know one another over some drinks, maybe a little cuddle session, whatever else may follow. Not just a quickie type of thing. After responding to this ad, the man and I talked for about a month through texting, without ever making concrete plans of meeting. I finally got the confidence, though, and asked him if he wanted to meet up. He agreed, and we decided that I'd drive over to his place, which was about 10 miles from me and outside of the city limits. That day we decided to meet. It was starting to get late, about 6 p.m. The sun was still out a little bit, but it was starting to get very dark. I got in my car and drove out to the area where he said he lived. The guy texted me and said he'd be waiting on the side of the road because he was coming back from visiting with a friend. He asked that I pick him up to go back to his place. He had told me before that he had 2 kids that lived with him, but the kid's mother wasn't in the picture. He said that his kids were at a friend's house and would be back later, so we'd have the place all to ourselves. While making my way to the man's house, I suddenly spotted him walking on the side of the road. He was holding a large speaker and covered in a hoodie, which seemed strange because it was kind of hot where we were at. The road we were on was very much outside the city lines, on a dirt road with random trailers set up every acre or so. I stopped the car and said something friendly and playful. "Hey there, stranger, need a ride?" He didn't smile, though. He just opened the door silently and got into my car, never saying a word. I thought this was really strange because we had literally spent a month having friendly chats, and I figured he'd act happy to see me, or at least not so awkward about it. After picking him up and making my way to his house, he then tells me to turn around and go back to the main road. He wanted to get a blunt and smoke some alcohol so that we could have a chill time together. I didn't see anything strange in this, so I agreed and started to head back. While on this long dirt road with no streetlights, he mentions that his house power is out and asks if that's okay with me. I was slightly thrown off by this, but I said, sure, as long as you have candles or something to use as a light source. He didn't say anything, though. He just kept looking straight ahead, as if I had never said anything at all. I then thought, what about your kids? How are children living in the house with no power? So I asked him. This is where things started to get very strange. He replied, "Oh, they're staying with my mom for a while." But he had just told me a few days ago that they lived with him, no mother in the picture at all. Questions started to run through my mind, but I didn't yet feel like I was in trouble. We arrived at the store and he got out with his face and head covered, like he was trying to hide from somebody. This all seemed so strange. He then got back in the car after making his purchase. While traveling back to his place, which was about a 15-minute drive, he then told me I had to sling crack to get money for this, just so we could hang out tonight. I was very surprised and shocked that he would just randomly drop this on me. The situation was getting quite sketchy, so I asked him if he had condoms, just in case we decided to need them. He said no, so I dropped him off at another store nearby before starting our journey down the long dirt road. After inconsistent and strange behaviors coming from this guy, I was just really wanting to get out of the situation as fast as I could. I dropped him off at the local grocery store to pick up the condoms, thinking this could be a good chance to just kind of slip out. I could just drive away, block his number, and be completely done with the situation. After we walked into the store, I was trying to decide what to do at this point. I wanted to just drive away, but I'd feel bad just leaving him stranded there. I finally got the nerve to leave, but his huge speaker was sitting on my floorboard still. I wanted nothing connecting me with this person, and feared that he might possibly say I stole his speaker and get me in trouble. I got out of my car and ran to the passenger side, opened the door and started dragging the speaker from my car. Suddenly I heard, "What are you doing?" It was him. He was right behind me. Fear ran through my body for some reason, like I'd been caught stealing something or lying about a bad grade to my parents. "Oh, I was just going to move this to the back seat so you'd have more room in the car." Thankfully, I thought of a quick save, and he seemed to have bought my horrible explanation. But now he's here in my car, and the only out is gone. Here we are driving down the old dark dirt road in the night, and all that's going through my mind is, how am I going to get out of this alive? I was trying to catch him in another lie, to see if this was actually happening or if I was just having an overactive imagination, but I couldn't seem to pry any information out of him. He just sits behind me looking straight ahead, fidgeting with something in his pockets, as though he had a mission to complete, and I was just there to bring him to it. After driving about 15 minutes down the dirt road, I realized there was no longer even any trailers. The road was completely pitch black, only lit up by the light from my car headlights. I asked him if his place was coming up, because the navigation told me it should be right there. "Oh, the address I gave you is an old business. My address doesn't show up on Google Maps for some reason." Red alert. I started panicking, just knowing that I was about to be robbed or killed in just a few moments. I slowed the car down, thinking of anything that could get me out at this point. I told him that my best friend was waiting for me to get back to have drinks with her. I told him I didn't realize we'd be driving so much, and that it'd take this long into the night. I'm not sure if he bought this part of the excuse or not, but I told him that I had texted my friend the address he gave me, just so she'd know how long I would be out, and when to expect me back for our planned night out. He seemed to believe me, and got very irritated. "Well, can't we just have a little car fun real quick right here? Nobody lives out here, it's not like anybody will see us." "No, I'm sorry. My friend is going to be pissed, and she's already called me while you were in the store. I told her I'd only be about 30 minutes and back in time for drinks." I was ready to abandon my car at this point if he pulled out a knife or anything other than a gun, but luckily he just kind of huffed, hopped out of my car and slammed the door. He started to put his head in the window to tell me something, but I quickly hit the gas and turned the wheel, leaving nothing but a smoke cloud behind me. I couldn't make him out in the rearview mirror due to the darkness of the night, but I imagine he must have been flipping me off or coughing from the dust plume made by my tires. After pulling myself together and realizing that I might have been the next Oprah story, I called my friend, who wasn't waiting for me, my mom, my sister, everyone that I loved, and told them a slimmed version of the story that took place that night. I teared up a little, thinking that I might have almost died, but that feeling went pretty quickly. When I got home that night, I decided to pull up the actual address he gave me. I noticed that about 2 miles down the road, there was one lone house, sitting alone with no neighbors. The road was a dead end. I then used Google Street View and saw that the house was completely abandoned, no doors even, and completely overgrown walls. I Googled the actual address of that house and found out that it was posted for sale years ago and was just never bought. I'm guessing nobody wants to purchase a possible crack house. My friends would later tell me that they imagined that he wanted to get me to the house and do whatever he wanted with me. Since there's no traffic that far down the road, I'm sure it would take quite a while to find a body that had gone missing. After all of this, I vowed never to meet anyone from Craigslist ever again, unless it's in the police parking lot. I did vow to just never leave my house, but school and work have made that impossible, as you might imagine. All in all, I'm pretty okay with what happened, but it really brought to light what could happen when you least expect it. As a third-year university student, I like to think that pizza, gyros, and hamburgers are most important staples of my cost-effective, not really nutritious nutritional needs. Needless to say, it wasn't long before I became besties with the guys running the local pizza parlor, just about 3 blocks from my house. The guys were very cool. I met them for the first time when my best friend Sharon, Cher for short, and I went in to buy a pizza for our movie night. I wasn't too jazzed about the movie night, though, because my lesbianist roommate Sam insisted on joining in. I'm not homophobic. Cher is the biggest lesbian out there, and she tells me a lot that I have a very nice butt. I was Sam-phobic, though. She had decided pretty on that apparently I was hiding my true lesbian nature, and had been trying to get me to accept myself for what she believed me to be, for 3 months. This meant that movie nights with her mostly consisted of that one where Cuba Gooding goes on a gay cruise, the one with the chick working in a flower shop, and the one where Nikki from OINTNB is a high school cheerleader rooting for her own team. I wasn't too stoked on the night. These mostly ended in deep conversations about the importance of revealing your true sexuality. Neither was Cher, to be honest, because Sam just had a way of making things really fucking awkward. Sam would later go on to tell Cher's girlfriend of 5 years that Cher was cheating on her in an attempt to break them up so that she could later help Cher pick up the pieces. Anyway, I told these pizza dudes about my roommate and her crazy movie night antics. They tried to help us out by inviting Cher and I to come back at midnight to watch a horror movie on their projector that they had set up in the dining area. I'm pretty big on horror movies, so to me it sounded like an awesome idea. Cher, on the other hand, thought it sounded like a plot to kidnap and murder us, so of course we were going. Over the next couple of months, I became really tight with the guys, and I would come over every Friday night for scary movie night and discounted pizza. The dudes were very cool, and it was a good way to get time away from Sam, who had begun to track my movements like Dog the Bounty Hunter. The guys were pretty successful with their pizza, and pretty soon they had to hire on more drivers, which is when I first met Bill. And Bill is pretty much your stereotypical example of an old guy who just failed at life. He was in his 40s, but he looked like he was pushing his late 60s. He was constantly high, and he never showed up to work on time, but he always had a really measly, long-winded excuse full of anecdotes about why his life as a pizza delivery guy was oh so hard. Customers hated him too, to be honest. When they opened their front door, he would push his way into the house and put their pizza on the kitchen counter, something he thought would get him a bigger tip. He just wouldn't leave their front door until they gave him what he thought was a big enough tip. If they didn't have enough money, then he'd tell them they could tip him in pot. If they didn't have that, then he'd start to yell at them for being cheap assholes. One night I was studying, and had to order in instead of going out. Normally the guys only send the cool delivery guys to my place, but that night just so happened to hit the rotation with Bill. He stood in my doorway chatting me up for a long time, and told me about how the guys all called him Big Bill for a reason. So obviously, Bill needed to get fired yesterday. These guys do what they have to do, and give him his notice. I come into the shop on Bill's last working night, and talk to my buddy Pete about the firing. Apparently Bill was taking it really well, and was just about to finish his last delivery of the night. I hung around to talk to Pete about his troubles with his crazy girlfriend, who I actually found to be a pretty nice lady. Bill comes in, and while we're talking he tries to jump into the conversation. I was standing at the counter with Pete behind, and Bill at my side. He started offering me rides home, which I declined of course, because hey, the dude gives me the skeevies. He kept insisting that it was on his way, but I kept telling him it was only a 15-minute walk and I'd be just fine. He then started to get pouty, and then said I probably didn't want to get in the car with him because I thought he was creepy. He hit the nail right on the head, but since this is Canada and we're polite to a fault, I just kind of laughed it off and just insisted that I'd really just rather not. He kept pouting and went outside to have a smoke in his car. On the way out, he grabbed my ass, though. This sort of abuse isn't uncommon for my bum, but it still pisses me the hell out whenever it happens. As soon as Bill was out the door and halfway to his car, I told Pete about the ass grab, and Pete was a total dude about it, and told me that it was a good ass and that he'd probably have done the same if he had the balls. I was as pissed as a wet cat, and it was getting late, so I started my trudge back home. At the crosslight, a gray piece of junk that I recognized as Bill's car drove right up beside me. Bill rolled down his window and asked if I was sure I didn't want to ride. Even after his charming ass-grabbing, I was still pretty keen on not getting in the car with him. Who would have thought, eh? So once again, no thanks, dude. He pulled to right, presumably to loop back into the parking lot of the pizza shop. He shot me a smile and a creepy little wave. I hated that guy. I kept on walking until I reached the next crosswalk. When I was halfway across, that gray little shit beater drove up behind me and kept blasting on the horn. The car drove past me, so I figured it was just Bill being an aggressive dick like usual. I walked down Main Street, keeping my eye out for him, until I reached the gate leading from the street to the backyard of my house. I'm usually pretty nervous entering the backyard because it's dark as the bottom of the ocean in that bitch, so I grabbed my keys between my fingers for a makeshift pair of brass knuckles just in case. All was good in the backyard, but when I turned the corner to reach the front of the house, I saw that gray shit beater parked on the curb. One thought went through my head. Fuck. So I'm not super rational. Even though I was standing right at the entrance to my landlord's basement suite, I instead bolted an extra 20 feet for my front door. I felt like I was going at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and that he was at 0.3 Michael Myers paces per minute. Michael Myers is one slowly but surely motherfucker. I reached the door and fumbled my keys, when I heard his car door slam shut. I got so startled I dropped my keys on the fucking ground like an idiot. I whipped around to pick them up when I heard him whistle. I jammed the keys into my door, turned and slammed that shit behind me as fast as I could, and turned the lock back. Suddenly, my life got really quiet. I didn't turn on any of the lights. I just went from the front window and watched. I couldn't make out Bill, but I could see that he was in the car from the lit end of his cigarette. I called for Sam, but she wasn't home, so instead I called Pete on the phone. Our conversations basically went like this. Pardon my excessive use of the French language. A generic Italian mob boss pizza, Pete here. What can I... Fuck, shit, Pete. What the fuck? Bill followed me home, man. Whoa, what? Fucking creepy-ass ass-grabbing fucking Bill is right outside my house. Dude, he's supposed to be on the other side of town. I asked him to do a delivery at 10 Mile like 20 minutes ago. Well, he's right fucking here. Come on, he's probably just pulling the shit because he thinks you're pretty and it's his last shift. Are you sure it's him? It's not like my town had a shortage of gray beater cars, but I think I'd seen this one enough times in one night to make a positive ID. Yeah, dude, it's definitely him. Okay, I'll be over there in like 15 minutes. I hung up on Pete and moved away from the big window, so that I could hide in my room where I could look through a smaller window he was less likely to see me in. All of our doors lock, and are really heavy-duty, so I felt pretty secure in that back room. I didn't turn on my bedroom lights, but I crumpled once I locked the door. I sat there for a little bit, trying to calm down my breathing. I heard my landlord watching a movie downstairs in his living room, but I didn't get up until I heard the doorbell. The only way to reach the door to the downstairs suite was to walk down the stairs leading to the front door, and then take the next set of stairs down. I was determined to get to my landlord, a way bigger guy than Pete, but I needed to get past our windowed front door first, where Bill would be able to see me if he was at the door. At this point I was pretty scared, and being scared makes me really angry, so essentially I just said fuck it. I raced down the stairs to the front door. I could make out his head and the left half of his body through the window pane. He saw me try to sneak past and called out. Hey, and what? It's me, Bill, from Generic Italian Mob Boss Pizza. And Pete sent me over with a free pizza for you. I noped myself right down the stairs to my landlord's door. I knocked, and he groggily opened it up for me. I tried to rush the explanation of the situation, which basically boiled down to, Mr. Landlord, there's a creepy pizza guy that followed me home and now he won't leave. My landlord is pretty much the coolest dude ever though, so he snaps wide awake and rushes to the front door. He used his adult voice and told Bill off that I didn't order pizza, and that if he didn't leave, he was going to call the cops. Bill didn't respond, but thankfully he walked back to his car. He actually did have a pizza box, but probably the one meant for another order. My landlord was very tired, so he gave me a quick, "Hey, just come get me immediately when crazy stuff like this happens, okay?" And then he just walked off to bed. I watched Bill in his car from the big window, keeping my screen on and lit as bright as it could go, so that he could see that I had my phone ready on dial. He started up his shit box and rolled down the road. I called Pete at the pizza place to tell him that my landlord handled it, and he didn't have to come anymore. Pete waited for Bill to come back, and then basically threatened the life of his Big Bill namesake if he ever came back to the place or near me again. It's been almost 2 years since then, and I've never heard from or about Bill since. In the end, I didn't call the cops, which if you read my post about the tomboy and the mountain goats, you'd know that's just kind of the way I was raised. I don't know if it's a cultural difference between Canadians and Americans, but I've only called the cops once in my entire life, when I was just too young to deal with the situation myself. 3 teenagers were mugging a 20-something-year-old dude. Sorry if it offends you that I didn't call the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Luckily for the women of Canada, though, Bill emits his creepy vibes like the sun emits heat, so I'm pretty sure he'll never get more than a step ahead before they all realize what's up. This was back in the November of 2018 and takes place in North Carolina. I was 14 at the time, and my family and I had just moved across states. We had also just arrived in the city we planned on living after a very long road trip. We were all very hungry, so we decided to go grab some dinner before we went to pick up the keys to our new house. We decided to go to this local pizza shop, since we had our dogs with us because we hadn't moved into our house yet. We decided we'd just eat in the car in the lot. I've always been a pretty fast eater compared to the rest of my family, so I finished way before them. After I was done, I decided to bring my puppy out to do her business while the others were eating. We were standing just a little ways up from the car, playing around with the leaves on the ground. I grew up in Florida, by the way, so I wasn't used to seeing these big piles of autumn leaves. So there I was, just living my best life, not paying attention to my surroundings, when suddenly a man taps me on my shoulder. My dog noticed him and immediately tried to jump on him as she does with anyone, so I pulled her back while I was backing away from him. The man looks to be in his mid-40s to early 50s. He smiles creepily at me, like it was particularly forced. He then says in his scruffy southern voice, "You have my dog, my border collie." Immediately a red flag goes off in my mind. My dog looks very obviously like a boxer, nothing like a border collie. Now let me tell you, I'm horrible at confrontation. So I just nervously say, "I think you're mistaken, sir. This is my dog." I didn't even mention to him how my dog doesn't look anything like what he was describing. I look over to my parents' car, which was just a couple of feet ahead of me, unsure of what to do. They hadn't even noticed the man approaching me. I could see that they were on their phones. The man now asks me, "Well, would you be able to come help me look for my dog?" I can feel my stomach drop in that moment. I still don't want to make a scene, as I feel like I'm probably overreacting, but I've read my fair share of kidnapping and sex trafficking horror stories, so I have an idea in the back of my mind on what's currently going down. He then says something along the lines of, "Come on, I have some money in my truck for you," if I went with him to help. My hands were sweating at this point. He was like some cartoon villain out of a Reddit thread. He points over to a very sketchy, run-down looking truck. I tell him I'm busy and have to go, but best of luck finding his dog. Still trying to keep him on my good side. Looking back on it now, I don't know why I didn't tell him my parents were right there. If I would have just said that, I think he would have backed off. I overly worry about what others might think, so I think I was just trying to be polite and not make him mad at me. He then grabs a hold of my dog's leash and says he had dog treats at his truck and started to walk away with my dog. I pulled the leash away from him and said sternly, "I have to go now." As I start walking away, he grabs my wrist tight and rips the leash out of my hands, throwing it to the ground. He started pulling me with him, mumbling something like, "Just come see what I have for you." My dog, the sweet, good girl she is, follows after us and starts barking, while he starts to drag me along with him. I'm pretty small, 5'4", and have no upper body strength, so I just start screaming for him to let go of me. My parents were alarmed hearing me scream and seeing our dog chasing after me barking. Seeing this man pull their daughter against her will, they immediately came sprinting after me. I started screaming for them both. I think he got alarmed when he heard me call out Mom as she started running towards us. The sudden realization hit him that my parents were right there in their car the whole time. He made a quick run for it, and we didn't run after him. My parents were just glad that he didn't take me away. This was definitely not a good way to start off our new life in North Carolina. I hadn't even lived there a full day yet. I don't wish this would ever happen to anyone, as it was completely terrifying. But my advice for you is, don't be afraid to use your words even if they offend the person. Then is not the time to worry about what others think.